I wanted to introduce Dr. Gardner. I wanted to say we are fortunate that we have a CEO who is dedicated to provide Jawonio employees with the best of the best. And that's no different right now. We are fortunate to have a distinguished medical professional in our midst, who is from Westchester. Her most recent work is an article that was published in Psychology Today on the collective trauma of the Black community, right? And she is very passionate about health and wellness for all people. And she's here to give us her expert advice. It's more industry information on the importance of being immunized and help this, help with dispelling the, the beliefs of some of these, conspiracy theories that are out there. So let's welcome Dr. Traci Gardner, and everyone feel free at the end of her her presentation, feel free to ask any questions that you may have. Dr. Gardner.
So this is a slideshow that I did for Children's Village. And I did this, I can't remember now, but it was, early COVID. I'm going to call it early COVID. But the truth is we're still in the pandemic. So, we also sort of need to be reminded of that. So the objectives here is to discuss and understand vaccines, to take a historical look at racial and ethnic discrimination within the healthcare system, and to discuss the COVID-19 vaccine. And basically, we're all on this journey together towards knowledge and ultimately get to understanding. So I always start, and I don't know, Viola, I think you've heard this before. Am I correct? Were you on when I did this before?
Yes.
Okay, so she was on when I did this before, and this part of my presentation gives us a little historical content, because a lot of people talk about this vaccine was new and what have you, and we'll talk about that later. But the truth is vaccines are not new, right? Inoculating is not new. And although we talk about smallpox from 1796, and the truth is that the smallpox, the person who ultimately got the credit for the smallpox inoculation had actually received the initial understanding of science from the enslaved Africans that they had brought over. So it's actually even earlier than the 18th century and more likely to be closer to the 17th century. But the smallpox was the original when they saw that there were some nursemaids who would acquire cowpox because they were taking care of cows, that they had some immunity towards smallpox. So the thought process came over to inoculate people with something that is similar to or inactivated or a smaller version of that. Could you actually get them protection? And that's how that started. And some of us, like myself, I have this little mark on my arm, and some do, but my children do not, because it was completely eradicated in 1980. So because everyone, it was a required vaccine, and almost everybody was vaccinated who was born of a certain age, smallpox was eradicated internationally for the most part. And so we don't no longer have to get smallpox. So vaccinations have always been an important part of our public health system. So Balto is a fun one, because, and by the way, if you have a question or whatever, at any point, you can just stop me and just, say, Dr. Gardner, I have a question, and just ask the question. I'm pretty informal. Balto, I don't know if anybody has ever seen this, but Balto is a movie that it's really about what happened in 1925, although the movie came out in the 90s. But it was about Balto the dog, who ran the first Iditarod, and what that Iditarod was going across Alaska to bring the diphtheria vaccine to children who were dying of diphtheria and pneumonia in in Nome, Alaska. So that's how, and that's the story of how they ended up with the story of Balto. So if you haven't ever seen Balto, it's a great movie to watch, and it gives you some idea again of an understanding of something that most people don't even know, diphtheria, that they are protected against and never have to ever think about it because of what happened in 1925. So understanding vaccines, why are vaccines created? Because the disease they are, because the diseases that they are preventing lead to disease and death. No different COVID, that same thing is true here. How do vaccines work? Vaccines contain a weakened or an inactive fragment of a particular organism, which we call an antigen. It triggers an immune response in your body, and you've all seen this. And as a response to the actual organism, your body builds up antibodies. And so when your body encounters the real antigen, the real antigen, the real virus, from the real organism, you already know your body knows how to defeat it, and then therefore preventing, hopefully, from you getting disease and death. That is the quick and sort of brief version of how vaccines work and how they work in your body. Welcome to those who have joined us. So people always ask, what about side effects, Dr. Gardner? Vaccines have side effects. So let me just tell you, everything has side effects, right? So, Benadryl is really an antihistamine that you're supposed to be using for allergies, but no one seems to terribly mind the side effect of making you sleepy, unless it's in the middle of the day, right? So Benadryl is not meant to make you sleepy. It's a side effect of the medication that we seem to be okay with, right? And so everything has some side effects, and we always weigh risk versus benefit. But most of the side effects that are associated with vaccines are really about your body doing the work it's supposed to be doing. It's a sign that your body is starting to build protection against the disease. And some of those, as you've seen, and you can definitely read these, you can Google this. They're mild fever, people have pain at the injection site, chills, feeling tired, headache, muscle aches, and things like that. Feigning had occurred, although much less common. And let me say this, some people's fears were none of the above. I found out that some men that I knew, they were afraid of needles. I mean, that it really came down to needles. They just didn't want to have a needle. Like they didn't want that. And so people have various reasons, and they're real to them, and they're valued and matter. And I can say with great certainty, and those who have gotten the vaccine will tell you, that's got to be the best needle ever, because it really does not hurt at all. I don't know how they managed to do that, but it doesn't really hurt. Matter of fact, most people have said, "Oh, you're done yet? You're done? You did it already?" I'm not sure why, but it really doesn't hurt. The pain to the injection site comes a day later or so, or later that day. Okay, so let's talk about what initially was a huge part of the story of COVID, especially in the early part, and continues to be a problem, which is the history and racial discrimination that occurred in the healthcare system. So let me say this. This is not a question mark. This is a statement. There is racial discrimination in the healthcare system that continues to exist to this day. It has been actually the medical and the science, but specifically the medicine, has a horrid past in its relationship with the inception of slavery. And in fact, there were physicians on the slave ships that were part of throwing people over if they didn't have soundness or wellness. So, there's a long history of discrimination for various populations of people, not just on racial, but also ethnicity and other factors, right? LGBTQ, as well as developmental disability. So this is, but the racial ones have been going on since the inception of this country. So we know that to be true. So what I'm saying is they both can be true. There can be discrimination in the healthcare system, and you can still need to get the vaccine for protection. So they're not mutually exclusive. They both can be true. Although obviously getting the vaccine is always a personal choice, and whatever mental gymnastics people have to go there to get there, it's a whole, it's flips and turns, and it is a lot of, there's a lot of work. Especially I got mine in December, so there was a lot of, you know, mental gymnastics, what I call, to get to that point of getting the vaccine. And I think everybody has their own journey. Definitely a personal choice. But again, if you're asking me, I'm recommending it. So so I said this: people of African descent in the United States and across the diaspora mistrust the medical system, and it is valid, it is legitimate, and it's confirmed by data. But let's talk about the Tuskegee Project. First, let me say this: it is not the beginning of the story, and it's not the end of the story, but it is one of the longest chronicled and focused study of malpractice in the name of medicine and science in the country's history for a total of 40 years. So it started in 1932. It was a partnership between Tuskegee Institute and the Public Health Service. The public health persons were Clark and Bondler, and they partnered with Tuskegee. Now, what was happening prior to that was Booker T. Washington was very much into agriculture. He really was not into science, but he died. And when he died, the president of Tuskegee he was more of an agriculturist. I mean, he was more of a public health person and less of an agriculturist. So he had an interest in public health. And as a result of that, he wanted to look at health issues that affected the Black community, but they had ran out of money because in 1932, what happened, right? The stock market crashed. So they had lost their funding. And so the Public Health Service decided to continue to work with them and to help them to study and to treat these men. There were 399 Black men with syphilis and 201 that did not have syphilis. So over about 500, almost 600 people who were in the study. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, but they were not treated at all. So this is important. Why do I put this in? This is important because the difference between Tuskegee, which people bring up all the time when they talk about COVID, and COVID, is that COVID vaccine, we're trying to actually give people treatment. Tuskegee, they were trying to purposely not give people treatment. So they just wanted to watch these Black men and see how the disease played out and how they died. They had no interest in giving them. They said they were going to give it, but they were not giving it. And so in 1936, there was a first published paper that came out that criticized it, that we don't think these people are being treated. But that went nowhere. In 1945, penicillin was accepted as the treatment of choice, and yet the men did not get the treatment. And this went on until an article came out in 1972. So this is 40 years later. There was a lawsuit, and in 1974, $10 million settlement was reached to the families for reparations. So just in case people tell you that the United States does not give reparations, that is not true. They have given reparations for the Tuskegee, and although the Holocaust did not happen here, they have given reparations to Jewish families that suffered in the Holocaust. So it's important information to know that that did happen. So Tuskegee is very different, and it's important because it gets thrown out there as if there's some relationship. Right. The only relationship is treating Black people terrible, right? And like I said before, right, both can be true, and you can still need a vaccine, right? So I'm not dismissing that as legitimate, and it has happened. As well as Henrietta Lacks, which you all know about, how they used her cells for cancer treatment and never compensated her and her family. A big lawsuit around that. James Merriam Sims, who is known as the father of modern gynecology. Matter of fact, there's a statue of him, right, I think in Columbus Circle, in New York City, where he did horrific experiments on slave women with no anesthesia, using very crude instruments. There's statues of him all over. Black women continue to be 2 to 3 times likely to die during pregnancy than any other woman, and Black people are 1 to 5 times more likely to die from any cause as compared to other races. So all of that is true. So again, I'm not dismissing that the healthcare system has racial and ethnic disparities. All of that is true. It just doesn't change the fact that we're in a pandemic. The vaccine was, so I always get that the vaccine was rushed. Yes, it was, right? It was fast, but I wouldn't say rushed. Rush implies sloppily or hastily made. None was true. That is furthest from the truth. Dr. Kizmikia Corbett had been hired by by NIH in 2014 to actually come up with a coronavirus vaccine after MERS and SARS. MERS had happened in the Mediterranean and SARS had happened in China. So they were pretty sure, as Obama has said many, many times, that he was pretty sure that there would be another pandemic. So because he was sure that there'd be another pandemic, they had put resources into that. They had created a 69-page blueprint on what you should do. And then they hired people to create vaccines. So this was not rushed or fast or in a year or none of that propaganda. This woman started creating a vaccine in 2014. However, when you put money and resources and everybody is galvanized towards one movement, then something that would take you an additional 2 or 3 more years, you can finish the project you've been working on in 7 years and probably a year. So technology, focused money can allow you to do that most effectively. But so we're clear, most of it was not government money. It was all privatization. A lot of it was private money in order to get it done. What the government did was buy vaccines. So anyway, so now we're at
Dr. Gardner, is there similarities between the SARS virus and the COVID virus?
They're all coronaviruses.
Okay.
So they're different. COVID-19, why it was called a novel virus, because it was a new coronavirus, but it's in the same family as the SARS and the MERS. They're both coronaviruses. So in addition to that, so you had MERS, you had SARS, and then you had Ebola. Let's not forget Ebola, right? So you had Ebola as well prior to this. So they were pretty aware that another pandemic was going to come. Okay, so things were being put in place because we had so many, truth be told, in this like short period of time. So but because we had 2 coronaviruses prior, they felt like we probably needed to work on a coronavirus, which is why they started that in 2014.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. So Pfizer was the first, to get approval. Then obviously Moderna came pretty shortly after that, as well as Johnson & Johnson and then AstraZeneca. Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca are very similar. They're a different vector. I can call those vectors as different vectors, excuse me, of how it works, but they're very similar in how they work. AstraZeneca is not used here in the United States. Johnson & Johnson is used here. And so what was the big deal about a messenger RNA vaccine? If it is a new way of making vaccines, should we be worried? It was a new way of making vaccines, but again, not new, right? She's been working on this thing for 7 years, not new, right? And it wasn't new to science because we had already created medications that use messenger RNA, and the messenger RNA is a messenger, it's a genetic that allows you to read only. You cannot, what it does is that you cannot create proteins from it, right? You cannot create another virus. You can't, like the virus you can't take a piece of a virus, right? Which is they take the spike, right? And they take the mRNA of that spike, and then they that's in the vaccine. And then your body says that is foreign to me, right? And then it builds, what happens is it builds antibodies against that. So you do have some protein development of the mRNA, but it's just protein development so that you can build antibodies against it, not creating whole viruses. The best way I can explain that is like if you took, DNA from your arm, right? Or mRNA from your arm, you can't create a whole person. That's not how this works, right? You can't put a whole, you don't put them in a petri dish and you're going to get a whole person out, right? That's not how science works. So I know people were like concerned about that, but that's not how it works at all. They only take the spike so that they can figure out, so your body will recognize that as foreign and then create a response against it.
But some people were thinking that the vaccine actually had DNA And
or that it was live. And
right,
it's not.
live DNA.
So right. So yeah, all it is this little piece right here. That was all it was. Yeah, this little piece right here.
Mm.
And that's circled. That's all that was. People often ask about emergency use. The requirements for emergency use are far stricter than FDA approval. So people always ask me, will it be FDA approved? It will most definitely be FDA approved, right? Because they have emergency use authorization is much harder, and there's an independent piece to that as well that doesn't have to occur when you're doing just straight FDA approval. So they're very strict about this. But again, we have to be mindful. We were in a pandemic, right? So we want to, I mean, like, you know, we can't forget that we were home watching people die in a pandemic, right? And not just, you know, the numbers were staggering. I mean, we were all traumatized as we were, you know, hoping and praying that, you know, another family member or a friend or somebody or us would not catch COVID. So, you know, being in a pandemic is very real and decisions have to be made. So, and as you know, with 16 and up. All the trials contained 44,000 participants, which is the normal number of any trial. So there's not that they had less in this trial. It's the same number of any trial. You have to have 30 to 44. And and this was the normal number. This is actually at the high end. Because they wanted to be able to have an emergency approved. So they had high-end participation. There was no pregnant women involved in the study at the time. So there was no information on pregnant women, and there were no children under 16, as you know. Now we have had, we've had tests, we've had studies and trials that had 12 to 16-year-olds. So, you know, that time has passed, and all aspects were managed by an independent board. The Pfizer vaccine given in 2 doses 3 weeks apart had 83% white, 9.1% black, 2.8% Latino, 4.3 Asian, and 0.8 Native American and Alaskan Eskimo. And all the side effects are measured, and they continue to be measured, which is why, by the way, they don't think we're going to need a booster right now, right? Because they've been following these folks, and they still continue to have immunity, and they continue to follow other people too. My friend who got COVID in March 2020 continues to be followed because she's part of a study because she still can't taste her food. She can't taste food at all. So and that's been from March of 2020, so a year and a half. So yeah, they continue to follow those people. Adverse reactions. We've talked about these already. And I think there were 12 people who had appendicitis. Anything you have over in a period of time, they include as side effects in the study. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It doesn't matter what happens to you. It probably becomes part of the study, and they do a follow-up to see if it was part of the study or whatever. But that number is actually significantly less than the general population. It probably just happened to be that they got that during the time, but they always put it in. And no one was hospitalized with COVID, required ventilation, and there were no deaths in any of the studies. So COVID by the numbers, right? So currently where we are today, there are 331 million doses of COVID vaccine that have been administered, which is 158 million people have been vaccinated. So, I mean, but 606,000 deaths from COVID.
Wow.
Okay, 750 people have died after getting COVID despite getting the vaccine, right? This means, however, that that if you subtract the 750 from the 606,000, that means that the 605,250 people who died from COVID were unvaccinated. So what that looks like is that if you are vaccinated, you have a 0.0012% chance of dying from COVID if you get it or getting seriously ill. But if you are unvaccinated, you still, if you're looking at deaths, you have a 99% chance. So if you just look at those who are dying versus those who are, so the truth is, and there's lots of literature out here about this, is that most of the people who are dying from COVID now are all vaccinated, are all unvaccinated folks. Um, so,
Yeah.
I want to talk a little about the variant because we've been tracking the COVID-19 variant. And I know people have a lot of questions about Delta. So let me say this to you. This is an important piece, okay? Variants are not created in vaccinated people, okay? Variants, in order for a virus to mutate and create a variant, it needs an unvaccinated host. So as long as we have unvaccinated people, we will continue to have variants. Okay. And what happens is that viruses are smart. And what happens is that even they learn how to adapt. So what has happened is with the Delta variant is a little bit different. So the protection, even for the vaccinated, is not as great as some of the other variants that have occurred prior to it. In addition to it, it is way more transmittable. It is the disease is more severe, and there is death. So the severity of disease and death is way more severe. So that's why you're hearing people talk about it, which is why they're really, really pushing, because we cannot afford to go through the Greek alphabet. We cannot afford to be at epsilon and then, at gamma and iota and go through the Greek alphabet of variants, right? We need to really try to minimize this. And that's what happens with variants. This is not in isolation. A virus is a parasite, and it's not like, in essence, it needs a host. It has to have a place to live, which is why you notice that we stopped talking about you getting that COVID from surfaces, right? You don't really hear anybody talking about that as much anymore. We just want you to clean or whatever, but it doesn't really last that long in a surface, like 48 hours or something like that. It's like, it's not long at all. You know what I mean? That was like, when the beginning, we didn't really know. So we were erring on the side of caution, but we found that people aren't getting like that. They're getting it from person to person, right? So the virus needs an actual person. A surface, it really can't live on that long. It can't. It's not a bed bug. Like, bed bugs can like live forever dormant and they're like zombies. This is not that. You know what I mean? So this is they absolutely need a host. So it's so important to me. This is the most important thing that unvaccinated people need to understand, that you continue to be a host. And as long as you are a host, we will continue to have this problem with variants. And so the current truth is we are still in a pandemic. Okay. Because we have 47%, I believe, of the United States that is vaccinated. So we're still in a pandemic. And I know people are often scared and afraid to get vaccines, but faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. Right. And so we're hoping that with knowledge, science, and faith, and a little bit of faith, right? Whatever that means for you, okay, that people will eventually get there. But again, I cannot stress enough that it is a personal choice. But I would love for people to make personal choices based on having all the information. That's it. We've been doing inoculation and vaccination, right, for centuries at this point, right? So it's very hard to justify that kind of rationale, right? And it just doesn't hold water, right? I mean, but the truth is why we continue to watch people in studies, because we want to see. Most important, we study them to see how long, if they have any side effects. But the side effects we've seen don't really continue beyond a few days. But we really are looking for. We continue to watch side effects. So we do that with all vaccines, by the way, even though all of them have been out, diphtheria and polio and everything's been out there for whatever, 100 years. If someone gets a side effect of the ones we normally have, then we will still contact VAERS, which is the Vaccine Administration Air Reporting Service, we still contact them and they still document it. They do that for vaccines and medications as an extra precaution, even if we cannot prove that it is directly associated with the vaccine. We still do that. So there's a lot of caution with making sure that we really look at these things in depth. You know, you can say a lot of things. You know, I could say like, you know, we're going to be on the moon in 5 years, and we're all going to be living on Mars, or, you know, I don't know. Like, you can just randomly say a bunch of stuff. Doesn't really make it true.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true. But I like the fact that you compared the COVID to the Tuskegee project, because I've heard that a lot since the beginning of the pandemic. And I didn't understand where that was coming from. So addressing that was really important to give people a better understanding, because when the vaccine first came out, it was first opened up to first responders and healthcare workers, you know, and like you said, with the Tuskegee project, a lot of people, like the men who was in the, you know, the project didn't even get the care. They were not getting any of the medical care. So
that was the whole purpose of the project, was to not treat them.
Right.
That was the whole purpose, was to literally not treat them with anything. So so it's just not the same. I get the health disparity thing, but it's just, they're not the same. You just can't like throw something out there without information.
Right.
and not bring in the, you know, the details of that.
Dr. Gardner, I have a question for you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
The one thing I get is a lot of times I'm asked, oh, I don't want to get the vaccination, or I'm actually told, not asked, I don't want to get the vaccination because of all of these things that they're finding with the blood clots, and now with this myocardial inflammation and things like that. So when someone says something like that to me, I'm kind of like, well, those happen in rare instances. With the clotting, it was definitely with the Johnson & Johnson vaccination. It was people that were in certain categories that were at high risk. What do I say to somebody about the cardiac inflammation stuff that's going on? Like, how would you answer and try to allay the fears with that kind of stuff?
Okay, so this is a great question, and I get it too, right? So what I always say with the Johnson & Johnson is this. Okay, so let me step back. Let's pull out the whole clotting issue first. I would generally, if you asked me, if there was no clotting issue, okay, if you asked me, I would still be hesitant. Like, I would not be hesitant, but I would prefer that you would take the Moderna and the Pfizer over the Johnson, because if you had a choice, you would always want to have 97% protection than 80% protection, right? So the reason for the Johnson & Johnson was the fear of those people who would not come back, which we're seeing anyway. 10% of those who get the Moderna and the Pfizer don't come back, right? And we wanted to make sure that they had some immunity, and 80% is definitely better than 0. Right? But if you've convinced yourself, I'm going to do this and I'm going to definitely take this vaccine, then you might as well go with the Pfizer and the Moderna, because it's going to give you more immunity and it probably will last longer, right? And so they're currently recommending anyway for people to get in. And what they found is that people got a second dose. If they had the Johnson & Johnson and they gave them the Pfizer, that they just got this incredible boost of immunity. And so, and actually would boost up to closer to 100%. So, again, it's not something that I generally, when people ask me personally, I recommend it for that reason. So now, when we talk about the clotting, I remind people that the number was 6 out of 7 million. Okay, so that's one person.
Yeah, that's huge.
Right. right? So that is 0.00009, right? Zero, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right? So, right. So if you look at, so I always come with data, right? That's my like thing, right? So, because I always come with data. So, but if you look at the number of people who get clots in the community society, right? Just generally, without getting a vaccine, that number is much larger than that. So your chance of getting a clot because you were on a plane is significantly
Probably
higher.
better. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And happens all the time. And I can name off the top of my head, Heavy D the rapper died of a clot.
Right.
Serena, pulmonary embolism. Tony Braxton, pulmonary embolism from a plane. There's like tons and tons of people who travel a lot, who have had blood clots because it is that common, in women and of a certain age, and depending on how long your flight is. So although, and by the way, the system worked because there were 6 people out of 7 million and they still caught it.
Right.
Okay.
And that shows you how diligent they are about making sure that these vaccinations are actually safe and the efficacy is there. Like they've done their due diligence with like the research and development and making sure that things are checked. It's just difficult when someone's, putting this stuff out to you, how to rebut and, try to allay their fears. It's just difficult.
Right. So I usually say, don't take that one. Right.
Go with the others.
You may have that feeling about that one, right? But that's got nothing to do with the other 2, right?
Yep.
So, right. So just don't take that one. So when people ask me, I generally say, if you're between age of 18 and 30, then don't do it, right? Just don't take that one and go ahead and take that Pfizer and the Moderna. And I say that because although the number is just ridiculously rare and low, right? If it's you, it feels like 100%, right? So this don't do it, right? Don't put yourself at risk. Don't do it. You don't have to worry about it. And then you go on and take one of the others. So that's usually my explanation for when people ask me about the Johnson & Johnson. And that usually is enough to there's nothing else really you can say after I've said all that. Right? It's hard to come back from
it has been shown also that the getting COVID causes clotting issues. I mean, take your pick.
Right. That's the other piece, right? So important. So the other piece is that, right. And so the other piece is that more, if you look at the percentage of people who got COVID and who got clots, right, is significantly higher than those 6 people or anybody else who, right, but those 6 people who got the Johnson & Johnson and got clotting issues, right? So the percentage, if you get COVID, your chance of getting a clot is significantly higher. So the side effects that we're seeing in the vaccine, and this answers the question in the text, side effects that we're seeing, including the myocarditis, is transient. They recover. Okay. What we don't see for the virus is that they don't recover. Right. That you still have long-term complications.
Right.
Because what you actually have is the actual virus.
Right.
Right. So that's the problem, because the virus is doing something the virus itself is using your cell as a machine to create more of itself and have more of and create more of themselves and to have more productivity. That does not happen with the vaccine because there is no actual virus reproducing itself. So I'm not saying that there aren't side effects, right? There are, right? So myocarditis is a side effect, or even somebody's asking about facial paralysis. So I have seen hardly none of that, though I've seen it quite often. I haven't seen it with the vaccine, but I have seen it with COVID. Right. So I've seen it with the virus, but I haven't seen it with anybody with the vaccine. So I can't speak personally to that. But again, even the person who had it with COVID, the vaccine, the facial paralysis, it was very long. Like, it took a little bit long. You see that in Lyme disease and some other, and viruses in general can cause some. It's a Bell's palsy, and you see that in Lyme and other viruses, and it's generally transient. It happens. It causes an inflammation in your nerves, and then it eventually resolves. What we don't see, what we see is that resolution is just taking longer when you actually have the virus itself, because again, the virus is using your cells to produce itself, which doesn't happen with the vaccine. There's no virus there. I took it when we were unclear of whether it was safe, right? Because I had faith, right, to take the steps even when I couldn't see the whole staircase, right? Which is why I put that there, right? Because I had done listen, I am a person of color. I am a Black person. And so I understand more than anybody the health disparities that occur in the healthcare system. I literally have experienced it. I literally just experienced it with my mother 2 weeks ago. Like, if I'm not a doctor in the healthcare system, most people who aren't physicians or you miss the nuances. Like, you don't even realize you're being discriminated against. Like, you have no idea that it's happening. You know what I mean? And so it happens pervasively all the time. And so, I wanted to do more research. I wanted to know for myself. So I did. I'm not some robot, like, I'm a human being with children and a family, and I'm not going to take something that's harmful to me. I'm not doing that. And you know what I mean? I'm a thinking person. And so who cares deeply about their family. And so I wanted to make sure that before I took the vaccine, that I had done all my due diligence and that I felt that it was safe for myself before I did that. And I took it in December. Okay, so when it first came out.
Me too.
Right, so I was early, so I was real faithful. Okay, right. So I had a lot of knowledge in order to get there. And I had this conversation with my other colleagues, and the person who works with me is also a woman of color. And she was like, and she told me, she said, Dr. Gardner, I'm just gonna wait for you to take it and watch what happens with you. And then depending on what happens with you, I'm then gonna take it. Okay. But what was happening was that she was seeing what was happening with the virus, and people are just sick. Like, you guys have the sickness is so terrible and it's so long, and people are not recovering. Right. And there's a whole group of people in that early beginning part who dropped dead, who were diagnosed with pulmonary embolisms and all this, and aneurysms and all this other stuff, that they're pretty sure now were actually COVID. Right? But remember, in the beginning, we didn't have tests, right? Remember, there was a shortage of tests, so we couldn't even test people, right? People were just dying, And so, right. And so we started seeing what was going on early, and we said, what we do know is vaccines. I'm a pediatrician. She's a pediatrician. What we do know is vaccine science. Okay. And so nobody gets more vaccines than pediatricians. Okay. And so I have great discernment when it comes to vaccines. If I don't feel comfortable with a vaccine, I am not recommending it, period. Yeah. I mean, at this point, 331 million doses. Like, you can no longer say like it's not safe. Like, it's not 300. You know what I mean? Like, when I took it, like, you can definitely say that. Like, you could be like, Dr. Gardner. Like, people are saying to me, my family, my kids, I have 3 daughters, and my husband, they said, we just need you to know that if anything good happens to you, that you just need to know that what happened after is that we went postal. Okay. They were like, you just need to know that we lost our whole minds and went after everybody. Like, you know what I mean? They were very scared. I have a 27-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 19-year-old. And they were very, I mean, they're in that age group of all of, they're on TikTok, and TikTok said, and IG said, and so they were very nervous. And so they are all vaccinated. But then what happened is that they were tired of being fearful. Like, they were like, every time they would go out with their friends, and then they would be fearful that, like, a friend would be like, I think I got COVID. And then they would be fearful that I would get COVID. And then they would be fearful that they would be responsible for something happening to me or my husband.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah. And so they were like, the stress and the trauma of always being fearful that you were the next person was too much. Like, they came to, they were like, okay, you know what, Mom, we need you to sign us up. Okay, like, so they've been giving it to pregnant women. So that's already been, because they
Okay.
did, basically what they did was the OBGYN, whatever Academy of OBGYN, they had decided that they were going to recommend it. And the reason why they were going to recommend it is because they have been giving vaccines to pregnant women for forever, 100 years. So there's some vaccines they don't want you to get, like the live ones, but the
Right.
inactivated ones they've been giving. So they knew vaccine science and they were comfortable with it, and they've been giving. And if you look at the data of the number, and there were no pregnant women, I told you there were no pregnant women in the trial. So this is like faith. Pregnant women were like, I just want it. Like they had to just make their own decision on the recommendation and just go with it because there was no data. And so now there's like lots of data, and they've had no issues with pregnant women. The other thing too that they're seeing, by the way, is an increase in the number of people who will get diabetes, who've gotten COVID, the virus. So I think that went up 14% in the general population from pre-COVID.